I've been all over the world, you know. I done seen the finest wine, I done seen the finest dimes, but all the pretty girls come from the
Look how massive that is. I'm in the Hood Canal of Washington and I'm doing a little coastal foraging for oysters. This location is special because you can harvest oysters just by walking around the beach. There are 5 different species you can find in Washington: the Olympia, Virginica, Pacific, Kumamoto, and the European flats. The Olympia oyster is the only native species to Washington, but in the 1850s, oyster fisheries were supplying California's demand until the industry collapsed due to overharvesting. The natural oyster beds that were growing for decades had diminished to the point where they couldn't rebuild it naturally, resulting in the near extinction of this species. While the oyster market was on the rise, in 1890, the Virginica oysters were the first non-native species introduced to the Pacific Northwest. This species was notoriously finicky and only thrived on the beaches of the Taunton Inlet. To sustain the demand, in 1904, the Pacific oysters were introduced from Japan as an experiment. This species flourished and became the dominant oyster cultivated on the West Coast. They carried the oyster industry and began spawning naturally in the 1930s. At the same time, a new oyster species was discovered, the kumamoto. We don't know exactly how this species was introduced to Washington, but the conspiracy is that the US was demanding more oysters, and in 1946, when Japan couldn't fulfill the order, they swapped in some kumamotos along with the Pacifics. This species is smaller and spawned in muddy waters, so it wasn't thought to be a commercial product, but in our present time, these are one of the most popular oysters in the US. Due to pollution, this species is thought to be extinct in Japan. And in Washington, the Pacific and Kumamoto oysters have crossbred to the point where there are no purebred species. European flats were introduced to Washington in the 1950s, but are not as dominant as the other species. You can only find these at farms. Washington has been dubbed the oyster nirvana, and that's due to the overall geography in its near-perfect oyster habitat. The bays and inlets remove excess nutrients like nitrogen from the water, and the tidal activity strengthens the oyster's abductor muscles and creates a thicker shell that's hardier for exportation. How is the industry holding up today? The Washington law for oyster harvest is to shuck the oyster and leave the shell so oyster larvae can cling onto the old shell and repeat the cycle. As a Washington resident in the Hood Canal, you can buy a batch of oyster larvae to harvest right from your backyard. The residents at the house I'm staying at have not bought oyster larvae in the 3 years that they have been here. And for a next door neighbor that rents out his Airbnb every week, he only needs to seed oysters once a year. So I'd say business is going pretty well. This is about 10 minutes of collecting. Look how much oysters we have. Plus, we have a bunch more that I just threw on the bank to collect. So we have literally these ginormous, massive clusters, which have 8, maybe 10 oysters on there. This is like a huge oyster shell, and then you can see there's a smaller oyster that took the place and cupped right there. Yeah!
I've been all over the world, you know.
Although I gotta stay at a house here, there are public beaches you can harvest oysters at as well. Just make sure you buy a license. Will you guys be making a trip to Hoodsport, Washington? If you like this video, leave a comment, share with a friend, and subscribe for more food-related content.